Our story begins in the wake of one of history's greatest conquerors. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE in Babylon, his vast empire fractured into competing kingdoms ruled by his generals. The eastern territories fell to Seleucus, one of Alexander's most capable commanders, who established the Seleucid Empire. This Hellenistic kingdom stretched across Persia, Mesopotamia, and into Central Asia, bringing Greek culture and administration to lands that had once been the heart of the Persian Empire. But empires built on conquest often contain the seeds of their own undoing. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, the Seleucid Empire had grown unwieldy and distant from its far-flung provinces. In the northeastern region of Parthia, a land of rugged plateaus and fierce warriors, discontent simmered beneath the surface of Greek rule. The Parni were a nomadic tribe from the steppes north of Parthia, skilled horsemen who lived by the rhythm of their herds and the strength of their bows. Around 247 BCE, under the leadership of a chieftain named Arsacid, these nomadic warriors swept down from the steppes and seized control of Parthia from the weakened Seleucid governors. The timing was perfect. The Seleucid king Antiochus II was embroiled in conflicts in the west, and the distant province of Parthia seemed barely worth the effort of reconquest. Arsacid established himself as the first king of an independent Parthia, founding a dynasty that would bear his name for centuries. The Arsacid dynasty, as it came to be known, would rule the Parthian Empire throughout its entire existence. This was no ordinary conquest. Arsacid didn't simply replace one ruler with another. He established a new model of kingship that blended the traditions of the nomadic steppe with the administrative structures of settled civilization. The early decades of Parthian independence were precarious. The Seleucids made periodic attempts to reassert control over their lost province, and the young kingdom had to fight for survival. But the Parthians possessed advantages that would serve them well. Their cavalry was unmatched in the ancient world. Growing up on horseback, Parthian warriors could shoot arrows with devastating accuracy while riding at full gallop. This military prowess, combined with the natural defenses of their mountainous homeland, made Parthia a difficult prize to reclaim. Under Arsacid and his immediate successors, the Parthian kingdom slowly expanded. They consolidated control over the Iranian plateau, absorbing neighboring territories and establishing a network of vassal kingdoms. The Parthian approach to empire was different from the centralized model of Rome or the earlier Persian Empire. The Arsacid kings ruled through a feudal system, allowing local nobles and client kings considerable autonomy in exchange for military support and tribute. The true transformation of Parthia from a regional kingdom into a great empire began under Mithridates I, who ruled from approximately 171 to 132 BCE. Mithridates was a visionary leader who understood that the continued weakness of the Seleucid Empire presented an opportunity for dramatic expansion. He launched a series of brilliant campaigns that would reshape the map of the ancient Near East. First, Mithridates turned his attention westward, toward the rich lands of Media and Mesopotamia. The Seleucid Empire, now declining rapidly, could offer little effective resistance. City after city fell to the Parthian armies. By 141 BCE, Mithridates had captured Seleucia on the Tigris, one of the great cities of the Hellenistic world, and soon after took control of Babylon itself. The ancient heartland of civilization was now under Parthian rule, but Mithridates didn't stop there. He pushed eastward as well, wresting control of territories in what is now Afghanistan and parts of Central Asia from the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. By the end of his reign, the Parthian Empire stretched from the edges of the Roman sphere of influence in Syria to the borders of India. Mithridates had transformed a modest kingdom into one of the two superpowers of the ancient world. What made this rapid expansion even more remarkable was how the Parthians managed their new territories. Rather than imposing a uniform system of governance, they adapted to local conditions. In the Hellenistic cities of Mesopotamia, they maintained Greek institutions and even struck coins with Greek inscriptions. In the Iranian highlands, they emphasized their connection to the ancient Achaemenid Persian Empire. This flexibility was both a strength and a weakness, as we shall see. The Parthian court adopted many trappings of Persian kingship. The King of Kings, as the Parthian ruler styled himself, claimed to be the legitimate successor of the great Persian monarchs who had ruled before Alexander's conquest. This wasn't merely propaganda. Many Parthian nobles genuinely saw themselves as restorers of Iranian greatness, standing against the cultural imperialism of Hellenism. Yet the Parthians were also pragmatic. They recognized the value of Greek learning and administration. Many Parthian nobles were bilingual, equally comfortable in Greek and Parthian. The empire's cities bustled with a mixture of cultures, languages, and religions. Zoroastrianism flourished alongside Greek philosophy. Merchants speaking Aramaic traded with travelers from as far as China, their caravans following the early routes that would become the Silk Road. As the 1st century BCE dawned, the Parthian Empire stood at the height of its power. It controlled the crucial trade routes connecting east and west, deriving enormous wealth from the silk, spices, and exotic goods that flowed through its territories. Its cavalry remained the most feared military force in Asia, and it had established itself as the dominant power in a region that had been fought over by empires for millennia. But on the western horizon, another power was rising. The Roman Republic, having conquered the Mediterranean world, was turning its gaze eastward. These two great empires, each supreme in its own sphere, were on a collision course that would define the history of the ancient world for centuries to come. The stage was set for an epic confrontation between the legions of Rome and the horsemen of Parthia. The Romans first became aware of Parthia as a significant power in the early 1st century BCE. Until then, Rome had been preoccupied with conquering the Mediterranean world, fighting rivals like Carthage and subduing the Hellenistic kingdoms of the East. But as Roman power extended into Syria and Asia Minor, it inevitably came into contact with the Parthian sphere of influence. The initial encounters between Rome and Parthia were diplomatic rather than military. Both empires recognized that they shared an interest in maintaining stability along their mutual frontier. There were even discussions of alliance against common enemies, but the fundamental clash of interests was unavoidable. The wealthy cities of Armenia and Syria lay in the contested zone between the two empires, and both powers coveted control of the lucrative trade routes that passed through these regions. The first serious conflict erupted over Armenia. This mountainous kingdom occupied a strategic position between the Roman and Parthian empires, and both sought to install friendly rulers on its throne. The competition for influence in Armenia would continue for centuries, becoming one of the perennial sources of conflict between Rome and Parthia. But the event that would forever define Roman perceptions of Parthia occurred in 53 BCE, at a desolate town in northern Mesopotamia called Carrhae. This battle would become one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman history, and its memory would haunt the Roman imagination for generations. Marcus Licinius Crassus was one of the richest men in Rome and a member of the first triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey. He had helped suppress the great slave revolt led by Spartacus, but he lacked the military glory of his political rivals. Caesar was conquering Gaul, and Pompey had won fame in the East. Crassus, despite his immense wealth and political power, craved martial glory to match his peers. In 54 BCE, Crassus received the governorship of Syria and immediately began planning an invasion of Parthia. His rationale was simple. Alexander the Great had conquered the East, and so could he. The wealth of Mesopotamia and the prestige of defeating Rome's greatest rival would secure his legacy. Despite warnings from more experienced advisors who understood the dangers of fighting Parthian cavalry in open terrain, Crassus assembled an army of approximately 40,000 men and marched east. The Parthian king at this time was Orodes II, a capable ruler who understood both the threat and opportunity presented by the Roman invasion. He divided his forces, leading one army north to secure Armenia and prevent it from aiding the Romans, while entrusting the defense of Mesopotamia to one of his most capable generals, a nobleman named Surena. Surena was young, perhaps only 30 years old, but he was a brilliant military commander. More importantly, he understood exactly how to use Parthian cavalry against Roman infantry. He assembled a force of approximately 10,000 horsemen, divided between heavy cavalry, known as cataphracts, and light horse archers. This force was much smaller than Crassus's army, but it was perfectly suited to the open plains of northern Mesopotamia. In the spring of 53 BCE, Crassus crossed the Euphrates and marched into Parthian territory. His route took him through the desert east of the river toward the city of Carrhae. The Romans were confident. Their legions had never been defeated in open battle by any eastern army. The disciplined infantry formations that had conquered the Mediterranean world would surely prevail against barbarian horsemen. But Surena had no intention of fighting the kind of battle the Romans expected. When the armies met near Carrhae, the Parthians refused to close for hand-to-hand combat. Instead, they employed a tactic that the Romans had never encountered on such a scale. The horse archers circled the Roman formations at a distance, pouring a relentless storm of arrows into the packed ranks of legionaries. The Romans formed their famous testudo formation, locking their shields together to create a protective shell. But this made them immobile, and the Parthian arrows found gaps in the defenses. Whenever the Romans tried to advance and close with their tormentors, the horse archers simply galloped away, their horses fresher and faster than the heavily laden infantry could hope to match. Crassus ordered his son Publius to take the cavalry and drive off the Parthian archers. Publius led a force of cavalry and lighter infantry in pursuit of what seemed to be retreating Parthians. It was a trap. Once separated from the main Roman force, Publius found himself surrounded by the Parthian cataphracts, heavy cavalry armed with long lances and armored in scale armor that covered both horse and rider. The cataphracts crashed into the isolated Romans with devastating force. Publius and his entire command were annihilated. The Parthians impaled his severed head on a spear and paraded it before the Roman lines. The psychological impact was shattering. Crassus, seeing his son's head displayed by the enemy, was paralyzed with grief and indecision. The battle devolved into a massacre. The Parthians continued their relentless archery, and the Romans had no effective response. Ancient sources, admittedly prone to exaggeration, claim that the Parthians brought up camels loaded with spare arrows, ensuring that their ammunition never ran out. Whether or not this detail is accurate, the fundamental reality was clear. The Roman infantry, so effective in the close-quarters combat of Mediterranean warfare, was helpless against mounted archers in open terrain. As night fell, Crassus and his surviving officers realized their position was hopeless. They attempted to retreat under cover of darkness, abandoning their wounded. The retreat became a rout. Crassus himself was killed during negotiations with the Parthians, possibly murdered, possibly killed in a scuffle that broke out during a tense parley. The circumstances of his death remain unclear, but the result was certain. Of the 40,000 Romans who had marched into Parthia, only about 10,000 made it back to Syria. Another 10,000 were captured and reportedly settled by the Parthians in the far eastern regions of their empire. The rest were dead. The Battle of Carrhae sent shockwaves through the Roman world. Rome had lost legions before, but rarely so completely and never so far from home. The disaster demonstrated that Parthia was not some minor eastern kingdom to be easily conquered, but a formidable military power with its own effective way of war. The captured legionary standards, the sacred eagles of the Roman legions, were kept as trophies by the Parthians, a bitter reminder of Roman humiliation. The battle also revealed fundamental truths about the nature of Roman-Parthian conflict. The Parthian military system, based on cavalry and especially on the combination of horse archers and heavy cataphracts, was ideally suited to the open terrain of Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. Roman infantry, despite its discipline and organization, struggled in this environment. Future Roman campaigns in the east would have to adapt to this reality or face similar disasters. For the Parthians, Carrhae was a triumphant validation of their military system and their status as equals to Rome. The victory enhanced Parthian prestige throughout the east and deterred Roman aggression for a generation. Serena, the architect of the victory, was ironically executed by King Orodes shortly after the battle, possibly because his success had made him too popular and thus too dangerous. Such was the nature of Parthian politics, where even the greatest victories could be fatal to those who won them. The defeat at Carrhae created a burning desire for vengeance in the Roman psyche. The lost legionary eagles became symbols of national humiliation that demanded redemption. For the next 2 centuries, Rome and Parthia would be locked in a cycle of conflict and uneasy peace, with neither power able to achieve a decisive victory over the other. The immediate aftermath of Carrhae saw Parthian raids into Syria, but the Parthians were unable to hold territory west of the Euphrates. Their military system, so effective on the open plains, was less suited to siege warfare and occupation. The Parthians briefly invaded Syria in 51 BCE, but were driven back by the Roman governor Crassus, one of the survivors of Carrhae. This pattern would repeat throughout the centuries of conflict. Neither empire could sustain long-term conquests in the other's heartland. The Roman civil wars that consumed the Republic after Caesar's assassination temporarily distracted Rome from eastern adventures. But these conflicts also drew Parthia into Roman affairs. In 40 BCE, the Parthians supported Quintus Labienus, a Roman rebel, in an invasion of Syria and Asia Minor. This Parthian intervention initially succeeded, with Parthian forces reaching the Mediterranean coast. But the triumph was short-lived. The Romans, even in the midst of civil war, could not tolerate such an invasion. Marcus Antonius, better known as Mark Antony, took it upon himself to restore Roman prestige in the east. After consolidating his control over Rome's eastern provinces, Antony launched a massive invasion of Parthia in 36 BCE. His army numbered over 100,000 men, making it one of the largest expeditionary forces Rome had ever assembled. Antony was determined to succeed where Crassus had failed, and to win for himself the military glory that would secure his position against his rival Octavian. But Antony's campaign proved to be another disaster, if less immediately catastrophic than Carrhae. The Romans invaded through Armenia and struck deep into Media, one of Parthia's core territories. However, the Parthians again refused to meet the Romans in the kind of set-piece battle where the legions might have an advantage. Instead, they harassed the Roman supply lines and picked off stragglers. Antony's siege train, essential for capturing the fortified cities of the east, was destroyed in a Parthian ambush. Without siege equipment, the Romans could not take the cities they needed to sustain their advance. As winter approached and supplies dwindled, Antony was forced to order a retreat. The withdrawal through the mountains of Armenia in winter conditions became a nightmare. The Parthians hounded the retreating Romans every step of the way, and thousands died from combat, disease, and exposure. By the time Antony's army stumbled back into Syria, he had lost perhaps a quarter of his force. While not as complete a disaster as Carrhae, the failed invasion demonstrated again that conquering Parthia would not be easy. Antony attempted another eastern campaign in 33 BCE, this time achieving some limited success in Armenia. But his attention was soon consumed by his final confrontation with Octavian. After Octavian's victory in the civil wars and his transformation into Augustus, the first Roman emperor, a new approach to Parthia emerged. Augustus was a pragmatist who understood the limits of Roman power. Rather than attempting another costly invasion, He pursued a diplomatic solution to the question of the lost standards from Carrhae. In 20 BCE, through a combination of military posturing and skillful negotiation, Augustus achieved what force of arms had failed to accomplish. The Parthian king, Phraates IV, agreed to return the captured legionary eagles and the surviving prisoners from Carrhae and Antony's campaigns. This was presented to the Roman public as a great victory, and Augustus had images of kneeling Parthians returning the standards carved on monuments throughout the empire. In reality, this was a diplomatic compromise rather than a submission. Phraates received recognition of Parthian interests in Armenia in exchange for the standards. But the propaganda value for Augustus was immense. He had restored Roman honor without the cost and risk of another military expedition. This diplomatic success inaugurated a period of relatively stable, if sometimes tense, coexistence between the two empires. The 1st century CE saw periodic conflicts, mostly centered on the perennial question of Armenia. In 58 CE, the Roman general Corbulo conducted a successful campaign that placed a Roman client on the Armenian throne, but Parthian forces under Vologases III soon reversed these gains. The result was a compromise in 63 CE. Armenia would have a king from the Parthian Arsacid dynasty, but he would receive his crown in Rome, acknowledging Roman suzerainty. This awkward arrangement satisfied neither side, but maintained peace. The reign of Trajan, from 98 to 117 CE, saw the most successful Roman invasion of Parthian territory. Trajan was one of Rome's most militarily aggressive emperors, and he dreamed of emulating Alexander the Great by conquering the East. In 114 CE, he launched a massive invasion. Unlike previous Roman campaigns, Trajan's expedition achieved stunning initial success. Roman armies swept through Armenia and Mesopotamia, capturing the great cities of Ctesiphon and Seleucia. Trajan reached the Persian Gulf, reportedly gazing out at the waters and lamenting that he was too old to follow Alexander all the way to India. For a brief moment, it seemed that Rome might finally succeed in conquering its eastern rival. Trajan created new provinces out of the conquered territories and declared victory, but Trajan's conquests proved ephemeral. As soon as the initial shock wore off, revolts erupted across the newly conquered territories. The Parthians, aided by local populations resentful of Roman occupation, waged an effective guerrilla war against the Roman garrisons. Supply lines were overextended, and Roman forces found themselves besieged in the cities they had just captured. Trajan's health failed during the campaign, and he died in 117 CE while attempting to return to Rome. His successor, Hadrian, immediately recognized that the conquests were unsustainable. He abandoned most of Trajan's eastern conquests, pulling Roman forces back to the Euphrates frontier. The grand dream of conquering Parthia had once again proven illusory. These repeated conflicts established a pattern that would characterize Roman-Parthian relations throughout the Parthian Empire's existence. Neither power could destroy the other. Rome was too strong in infantry and siege warfare and possessed too deep a reserve of manpower to be conquered by Parthia. But Parthian cavalry and the vast distances of the Iranian plateau made permanent Roman conquest of Parthia equally impossible. The result was a bipolar world order, with two superpowers facing each other across the Euphrates frontier. They competed for influence over buffer states like Armenia and the minor kingdoms of the Caucasus. They occasionally went to war, inflicting damage on each other but never achieving a decisive victory. And in between wars, they traded, exchanged embassies, and maintained a wary respect for each other's power. This equilibrium, frustrating as it was for Roman emperors who dreamed of universal conquest, actually served important functions. The presence of a formidable eastern rival prevented Rome from overextending itself. The competition between the two empires encouraged military innovation and kept border regions relatively secure. and the peaceful intervals allowed for cultural exchange and commerce that enriched both civilizations. To understand why the Parthian Empire endured for nearly 5 centuries, despite facing constant challenges from Rome and internal instability, we must look beyond military campaigns and examine the unique nature of the Parthian state itself. The Parthian system of governance was unlike anything else in the ancient world, combining elements of nomadic tribal organization, Persian imperial tradition, and Hellenistic administration into a distinctive and surprisingly resilient structure. At the apex of the Parthian state stood the King of Kings, a title deliberately chosen to echo the ancient Achaemenid Persian emperors. The Parthian monarch was more than just a political ruler. He was the living embodiment of the empire's legitimacy, the connection between the nomadic Arsacid dynasty and the great Iranian empires of the past. Every Parthian king bore the name Arsacid as a throne name, creating an illusion of continuity even as individuals came and went. Yet Parthian kingship was far from absolute. Unlike the centralized autocracies of Rome or Persia, the Parthian king ruled through a delicate balance of power with the great noble families of the empire. These aristocratic clans, many of them claiming descent from the original Parthian conquerors, controlled vast territories and maintained their own military forces. The most powerful of these families, such as the Surin and the Carrhae, were nearly as wealthy and influential as the king himself. This feudal structure, while it prevented the development of an oppressive centralized bureaucracy, also created chronic instability. Succession to the throne was theoretically hereditary within the Arsacid family, but in practice it was often determined by the support of the great nobles. Multiple claimants from different branches of the royal family frequently contested the throne, leading to civil wars that could drag on for years. The Parthian nobility formed a council that advised the king and claimed the right to elect and depose monarchs. This body, while never as formally institutionalized as the Roman Senate, represented a real check on royal power. A king who alienated too many powerful nobles might find himself without support, vulnerable to rivals who promised the nobility better terms. Below the great noble families were the lesser aristocracy and the landed gentry who formed the backbone of Parthian military power. These men provided the heavy cavalry that made Parthian armies so formidable. The cataphracts, armored cavalry that could charge in formation like medieval knights, were drawn from this class. Each cataphract represented a substantial investment in armor, weapons, horses, and training, and only relatively wealthy landowners could afford to equip themselves and their retainers in this manner. The horse archers who had devastated Roman legions at Carrhae came from a broader segment of society. Many were professional soldiers, but the steppes and highlands of the Parthian realm also produced farmers and herders who had grown up riding and shooting. This deep reservoir of cavalry was one of Parthia's greatest military assets. But it also reflected the decentralized nature of military power in the empire. Parthian cities presented a different face of the empire. The great urban centers of Mesopotamia, like Ctesiphon, Seleucia, and Babylon, were cosmopolitan places where Greek remained the language of commerce and administration. These cities had been founded by the Seleucids or inherited from earlier empires, and they retained much of their Hellenistic character under Parthian rule. The Parthians showed remarkable tolerance for this cultural diversity. Unlike Rome, which imposed Latin culture on its conquests, or the later Sassanian Persians, who would emphasize Iranian identity and Zoroastrian orthodoxy, the Parthians allowed their subjects considerable cultural autonomy. Greek philosophy was studied in Parthian cities. Jewish communities flourished in Mesopotamia, producing the Babylonian Talmud during the Parthian period. Various mystery cults from Mithraism to Christianity found adherents within the empire. This tolerance extended to religion as well. Zoroastrianism was the faith of the Parthian nobility and probably the king himself, but it was not aggressively imposed on others. The fire temples that would become so central to later Persian religious life existed in Parthian times, but coexisted with shrines to Greek gods and temples of various local deities. This pluralism made the empire easier to govern, but also meant that Parthia never developed the kind of unifying imperial ideology that Rome possessed. The Parthian economy was based primarily on agriculture and trade. The empire's position astride the trade routes connecting east and west generated enormous wealth. Silk from China, spices from India, and precious stones from Central Asia all passed through Parthian territory on their way to Roman markets. The Parthian government collected customs duties on this trade, and Parthian merchants grew rich, serving as middlemen. Control of these trade routes was both an economic advantage and a strategic asset. The Parthians could, and occasionally did, use their position to pressure Rome by restricting trade. The Romans, dependent on Eastern luxuries that their own territories could not produce, were vulnerable to such tactics. This economic interdependence gave both empires incentives to maintain at least periodic peace. Agriculture in the empire was diverse, reflecting the varied geography. The river valleys of Mesopotamia, using irrigation systems that dated back to ancient Sumerian times, produced abundant grain. The Iranian plateau was better suited to pastoralism and the cultivation of fruit trees. Wine, dates, and nuts from Parthian lands were exported throughout the ancient world. The Parthian tax system was relatively light by ancient standards, another consequence of the limited nature of central government power. The king collected tribute from vassal states and taxes from royal lands, but the great nobles controlled taxation in their own territories. This meant the central government never developed the massive bureaucracy that characterized Rome or Persia. But it also meant that royal revenues were often insufficient for major military expeditions. Parthian art and culture reflected this synthesis of traditions. Parthian sculpture showed Greek influences in technique, but Iranian subjects and sensibilities. The famous bronze statue of a Parthian nobleman from Shami, now in the Tehran Museum, wears distinctively Parthian clothing, but is rendered in a style that owes much to Hellenistic art. Parthian architecture likewise blended elements, with palaces featuring Greek columns alongside traditional Iranian iwans. The barrel-vaulted halls that would become characteristic of Persian architecture. Perhaps most distinctive was Parthian warfare, which we have already glimpsed in the battles against Rome. The Parthian military system was built around cavalry, and specifically around the combination of heavily armored cataphracts and swift horse archers. This dual system allowed for both shock attacks and mobile harassment tactics, making Parthian armies formidable opponents. The famous Parthian shot, where horse archers would turn in their saddles to shoot backwards while fleeing, became so iconic that the phrase entered multiple languages as a metaphor. This technique allowed the Parthians to hurt enemies who thought they were pursuing defeated foes. Combined with excellent horsemanship and composite bows of considerable power, it made Parthian horse archers among the most effective light cavalry in history. Yet this military system also had weaknesses. It was expensive to maintain and dependent on the personal retinues of nobles who might not always support the king. Parthian armies were excellent in open terrain, but struggled with siege warfare and mountain combat. The empire never developed a professional standing army like Rome's legions, relying instead on feudal levies that could be slow to mobilize and difficult to keep in the field for extended campaigns. The Parthian state, in summary, was a curious hybrid that defied easy categorization. It was neither fully centralized nor completely decentralized, neither purely Iranian nor Hellenistic, neither aggressively expansionist nor isolationist. This ambiguity was both its strength and its weakness. It allowed the empire to endure for centuries, adapting to threats and absorbing shocks that might have destroyed a more rigid structure. But it also prevented Parthia from ever achieving the kind of overwhelming dominance that Rome exercised in the Mediterranean world. The 2nd century CE represented both the apex of Parthian power and the beginning of the forces that would ultimately bring about the empire's downfall. During this period, the Parthian Empire reached its greatest territorial extent and cultural influence, successfully maintaining its position as Rome's equal despite repeated military challenges. Yet beneath the surface, internal contradictions and new threats were beginning to undermine the foundations of Arsacid rule. The reign of Vologases III, from approximately 105 to 147 CE, marked a high point of Parthian cultural renaissance. This king was a patron of learning who encouraged the collection and preservation of Iranian literature and religious texts. Tradition credits his reign with the beginning of efforts to compile Zoroastrian scriptures into written form, preserving oral traditions that dated back centuries. This cultural revival reflected growing confidence in Parthian identity and a conscious effort to emphasize the empire's Iranian heritage over its Hellenistic elements. This period also saw Parthian influence extend along the Silk Road trade routes. Parthian merchants were established in cities as far east as China, where they were known as traders from Annechi, the Chinese rendering of Arsaces. Parthian art, music, and luxury goods were prized throughout Asia. The empire's position as a cultural crossroads meant that ideas, religions, and technologies flowed through Parthian territory in all directions. Buddhism found adherents in eastern Parthian territories, brought by travelers from India and Central Asia. Christianity began to spread eastward from Roman Syria, finding converts in Mesopotamian cities under Parthian rule. The Jewish community in Babylonia flourished, establishing academies that would produce the Babylonian Talmud. This remarkable religious diversity, while it demonstrated Parthian tolerance, also meant that no single faith united the empire's diverse peoples. The military confrontations with Rome in this period followed the established pattern. In 161 CE, the Parthians invaded Syria, exploiting Roman difficulties on the Danube frontier. The Romans responded with a massive counter-offensive led by Lucius Verus, co-emperor with Marcus Aurelius. Roman forces once again captured Ctesiphon in 165 CE and once again found themselves unable to hold it. But this campaign had consequences that neither side anticipated. Roman soldiers returning from the east brought with them a devastating plague, possibly smallpox, that ravaged the empire for years. The Parthian Empire was likely also affected, though our sources for this period are limited. This epidemic, known as the Antonine Plague, killed millions and weakened both empires, demonstrating how interconnected the ancient world had become. The reign of Vologases IV, from 147 to 191 CE, saw continued pressure from Rome, but also growing internal problems. The great noble families were becoming increasingly powerful and independent, effectively ruling their territories as autonomous principalities. The king's authority outside his royal domain was often more theoretical than real. Civil wars over succession became more frequent and more destructive. In 197 CE, the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus launched yet another invasion of Parthia. Once again, Roman forces captured Ctesiphon, and once again they withdrew after plundering the city. But this campaign had more lasting effects. Severus annexed northern Mesopotamia, pushing Roman control east of the Euphrates for the first time on a permanent basis. The buffer zone between the empires was shrinking, and Parthian prestige suffered from the repeated sacks of their capital. More ominously, new powers were rising in the Iranian world that would challenge Parthian dominance. In the province of Fars, ancient Persis, local rulers, claiming descent from the Achaemenid Persian kings, were growing increasingly ambitious. These lords of Fars, who would later be known as the Sassanians, saw themselves as the true heirs of Persian glory and viewed the Parthian Arsacids as foreign, usurpers of questionable legitimacy. The Parthian response to these mounting challenges was hampered by the very structure of their state. The decentralized feudal system that had allowed the empire to endure for centuries made it difficult to mobilize resources for sustained military efforts. When the king tried to extract more revenue or military service from the great nobles, he risked rebellion. When he relied on their voluntary support, he might find it inadequate or withheld for political reasons. Economic pressures were mounting as well. The constant warfare with Rome, even if it rarely resulted in decisive defeats, was expensive. The need to maintain defenses along the western frontier, guard the trade routes, and manage the fractious nobility drained resources. The plague of the 160s had reduced population and tax revenues. Trade with Rome, while lucrative, made the Parthian economy dependent on a rival who could disrupt it during wartime. The eastern frontier also required attention. Nomadic peoples from Central Asia periodically raided Parthian territories, and the empire had to maintain forces to guard the Silk Road trade routes. The Kushan Empire, based in what is now Afghanistan and northern India, was a formidable power in its own right, and sometimes competed with Parthia for control of Central Asian trade. Despite these mounting problems, the Parthian Empire in the early 3rd century still seemed secure. It had survived for nearly 500 years, outlasting the Roman Republic and adapting to the Roman Empire. Its cavalry remained formidable, its trade routes lucrative, and its position as the great power of Western Asia unchallenged by any external enemy. But internal rot was far advanced. The succession disputes that had always plagued the Arsacid dynasty were becoming more frequent and more violent. Between 191 and 224 CE, at least 11 different men claimed the title of King of Kings, often with multiple claimants ruling simultaneously in different parts of the empire. This chaos weakened royal authority and gave ambitious nobles opportunities to pursue their own agendas. The great noble families, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly independent. Some were building their own diplomatic relationships with Rome. Others were expanding their territories at the expense of weaker neighbors. The empire was fragmenting not through conquest by an external enemy, but through the centrifugal forces inherent in its own feudal structure. Religious and cultural tensions also simmered beneath the surface. The Hellenized cities of Mesopotamia had different interests and identities than the Iranian-speaking nobility of the plateau. Zoroastrian priests were beginning to articulate a more exclusive vision of Iranian identity that had little room for the cultural pluralism that had characterized Parthian rule. Various religious movements, from Christianity to Manichaeanism, were offering alternative visions of community that transcended ethnic and political boundaries. Into this situation of internal weakness and de-mounting crisis stepped Ardashir, a local ruler in Fars who would bring about the end of the Parthian Empire and establish a new Persian dynasty that would prove even more formidable than its predecessor. Ardashir was not content with being a minor vassal of the Parthian king. He claimed descent from the ancient Achaemenid kings who had ruled Persia before Alexander's conquest. In his view, the Parthians were foreign intruders who had seized power during a period of weakness and chaos. The true rulers of Iran should be Persians from the heartland of the old empire, not nomadic warriors from the northeastern steppes. Beginning around 208 CE, Ardashir began consolidating power in Fars, conquering neighboring territories and building an independent power base. The Parthian king, Artabanus V, was distracted by threats from Rome and by rival claimants to his own throne. By the time he recognized the threat posed by Ardashir, it was too late to contain it through political means. In 224 CE, Ardashir and Artabanus met in battle at Hormizdagan. The details of the battle are murky, obscured by later Sassanian propaganda, but the outcome was decisive. Artabanus was killed and his army was shattered. Ardashir proclaimed himself King of Kings and founded the Sassanian Empire, named after his grandfather, Sassan. The transition from Parthian to Sassanian rule was not instantaneous. Some Parthian nobles continued to resist, and Ardashir spent several years consolidating his control over the territories that had been the Parthian Empire. But by 230 CE, the Sassanian conquest was complete. The Arsacid dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 5 centuries, was finished. The Parthian Empire had fallen not to Rome, its great rival, but to an internal rebellion that exploited the weaknesses inherent in the Parthian system. The fall of Parthia represented a profound transformation of the Iranian world. The Sassanians would prove to be more centralized, more aggressive, and more ideologically unified than the Parthians had ever been. They would wage even more intense wars against Rome and later against the Byzantine Empire. But that is a story for another time. The Parthian era had ended, and with it passed a unique moment in ancient history when the Iranian world was characterized by pluralism, tolerance, and a delicate balance between central authority and noble autonomy. As we draw toward the end of our journey through Parthian history, it is worth reflecting on the legacy of this remarkable empire and why it has been so often overlooked in popular understanding of the ancient world. The Parthian Empire ruled over one of the world's most strategic regions for nearly 500 years, yet it remains far less famous than Rome, less studied than Persia, and less celebrated in modern memory than many shorter-lived states. Part of this obscurity stems from the nature of our sources. Unlike Rome, which left abundant written records, histories, and literature, Parthian written materials are scarce. The Parthians wrote on perishable materials like parchment and papyrus that rarely survived in the archaeological record. They did not produce great histories of their own deeds in the way that Roman and Greek writers did. Much of what we know about Parthia comes from the writings of their enemies, particularly Roman historians who were hardly objective observers. The Sassanian Persians, who overthrew the Parthians, also did their best to minimize Parthian achievements. Sassanian propaganda portrayed the Arsacids as weak and degenerate rulers, whose fall was inevitable and just. Later, Persian historical traditions, influenced by Sassanian accounts, tended to skip quickly from the Achaemenids to the Sassanians, treating the Parthian period as an unfortunate interlude best forgotten. Yet the Parthian contribution to history was substantial and lasting. The empire maintained stability across a vast region for centuries, facilitating trade and cultural exchange between East and West. The Silk Road reached its first great flourishing during the Parthian period, connecting China, India, Central Asia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean world in networks of commerce that enriched all participants. Parthian military innovations influenced warfare far beyond their borders. The combination of heavy cavalry and horse archers that proved so effective against Rome was studied and imitated. The cataphract became a standard element of armies throughout the ancient and medieval world. The Parthian shot entered military manuals and remained relevant until firearms made horse archery obsolete. Roman military reforms of the 3rd and 4th centuries CE incorporated many lessons learned from fighting the Parthians. The political model of the Parthian Empire also had lasting influence. The concept of a feudal state, where power was shared between a monarch and powerful nobles, while it ultimately contributed to Parthian collapse, represented an alternative to both Roman centralization and Oriental despotism. Elements of the Parthian system survived into the Sassanian period and influenced the later Islamic caliphates that ruled the same territories. Culturally, the Parthian era was a time of remarkable synthesis. The blending of Greek and Iranian traditions that occurred under Parthian rule created art forms, architectural styles, and intellectual traditions that persisted long after the empire's fall. The Parthian period saw the preservation of much Iranian oral tradition that might otherwise have been lost, as well as the eastward spread of Western ideas and technologies. The Parthian approach to governance, with its tolerance for diversity and its relatively light touch in cultural matters, allowed different communities to flourish. The Jewish academies of Babylonia produced scholarship that would shape Judaism for millennia. Early Christianity spread eastward through Parthian territories, establishing communities that would survive into the modern era. The religious pluralism of the Parthian period, while it contrasted sharply with the later Zoroastrian orthodoxy of the Sassanians, represented a different model of how empires could manage diversity. Perhaps most importantly, the Parthian Empire demonstrated that Rome was not invincible, and that Mediterranean civilization was not destined to dominate the world. The repeated Roman failures to conquer Parthia showed that there were limits to imperial expansion, and that different military systems and different models of governance could be equally valid. The bipolar world order of Rome and Parthia foreshadowed later great power rivalries and showed that competition between empires could sometimes lead to stability, rather than constant warfare. For the Romans themselves, Parthia occupied a unique place in the collective imagination. It was the one great power that Rome never conquered, the empire that inflicted some of Rome's most humiliating defeats, yet also the state with which Rome could negotiate as an equal. Parthia represented the mysterious East, a land of exotic customs and formidable warriors, both threatening and fascinating. This ambivalence appears throughout Roman literature. Poets like Horace wrote of the Parthian threat, urging Roman audiences to remember Carrhae and demand vengeance. Yet they also acknowledged Parthian military prowess and the impracticality of total conquest. Historians like Tacitus, while critical of Parthian political instability, recognized the empire's endurance and the legitimacy of its claims to rule the East. The transition from Parthia to Sassanian Persia marked a shift in the character of the Roman Empire's eastern rival, but the fundamental geopolitical reality remained unchanged. The new Persian Empire continued to occupy the same territories, field similar cavalry forces, and compete with Rome for control of Armenia and Mesopotamia. The wars between Rome and Persia would continue for another 4 centuries, until both empires were exhausted and vulnerable to the Arab conquests of the 7th century CE. In retrospect, the Parthian period appears as a distinct era in the history of the ancient Near East. It was a time when the Iranian world, freed from both Hellenistic and later Sassanian centralization, experimented with a more decentralized model of empire. It was an age when cavalry supremacy shaped warfare and when control of trade routes brought enormous wealth. It was a moment when cultural tolerance allowed for remarkable diversity within a single political system. The end of the Parthian Empire did not mean the end of Parthian influence. Many Parthian noble families survived the transition to Sassanian rule, maintaining their lands and power under new overlords. Parthian military traditions continued in the armies of the Sassanians and their successors. The trade routes that had enriched Parthia continued to function, carrying goods and ideas across Eurasia. Even the Arsacid dynasty survived in a diminished form. Branches of the family that had ruled Armenia as Parthian vassals continued as an independent Armenian dynasty for centuries. The memory of Arsacid glory lived on in Armenian historical tradition, preserved in chronicles and legends that kept alive the story of the horse lords from the east who had built an empire. In the broader sweep of history, the Parthian Empire represents an important reminder that success in civilization building can take many forms. The Parthians never built monuments as grand as Rome's, never left literary works as influential as Greece's, and never created an administrative system as sophisticated as China's. Yet they ruled successfully over diverse populations, maintained a powerful military, facilitated commerce and cultural exchange, and preserved their independence against the most formidable empire of the ancient Mediterranean world. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind wander through the ruins of ancient Ctesiphon, imagining the great palace where kings of kings once held court. Picture the endless plains of Mesopotamia where Parthian horsemen once rode, their arrows darkening the sky above terrified Roman legions. See the caravans of merchants traveling the Silk Road through Parthian territories, their camels laden with silk and spices. Their conversations a babel of languages from a dozen different lands. The Parthian Empire is gone, its cities buried under desert sands, its palaces reduced to mounds of earth, its kings forgotten by all but scholars. Yet for nearly 500 years, the Parthians shaped the destiny of Western Asia. They stood as equals to Rome, the only power that could make that claim. They preserved Iranian culture through a period of Hellenistic dominance and handed it forward to the Sassanians, who would carry it into the medieval world. The horse lords from the steppes, the heirs of nomadic warriors who swept down from the north to seize an empire, proved that there were many paths to greatness in the ancient world. Their story reminds us that history is not simply the tale of the most literate or the most familiar civilizations, but the complex interplay of many peoples, many cultures, and many different ways of organizing human society. Sleep now, with visions of ancient empires dancing through your dreams. The Parthian horsemen have long since ridden into the mists of history, but their story endures, a testament to an empire that deserves to be remembered alongside the great powers of the ancient world.